All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking all about Calvin Ridley being suspended for the entire 2022 NFL season for gambling and what his future is, as well as what the Falcons do without him.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, writing weekly content for the Falcoholic, and of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, I thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and now on YouTube. Make sure you check out the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Please subscribe. Please give us a like when you do. Leave a comment and all that various things. So I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of comments on today's episode because we're going to be talking about Calvin Ridley being suspended. And, I was a little late to the party finding out this news because I was fully prepared to do a combine winners and losers episode today and sort of put my phone down for an hour and then come to find out Calvin Ridley suspended. So we have to sort of course correct and talk all about that. We'll be talking about his future, the Falcons' future without him, all that sort of stuff. But here's what we know so far now that we're a few hours after that news broke, that the NFL discovered that Calvin Ridley, during a 5-day stretch, in late November, bet on a series of games. Further evidence and reports have come out since that Calvin Ridley did bet on the Falcons during that stretch, presumably on that Falcons Jaguars game, and put in a series of parlay bets while he was traveling in Florida through the Hard Rock Sportsbook, which is, by the way, also now had their gambling operation suspended in early December, although it's unrelated to this in terms of betting in the state of Florida. But apparently he won that bet because the Falcons won against that Jaguars team. But the NFL released that he did not, or like there's no one in the Falcons organization was involved in that. There was no inside information on that. According to Calvin Ridley on Twitter himself, he said that he bet $1,500. I haven't been following all of Calvin Ridley's tweets on this subject, so maybe more information has come to light in the last hour, but at a certain point, you got to get off social media, Calvin. So the Falcons have known about this since early February when the league made them aware of it towards the end of the season, right before the Super Bowl. And according to various reports, teams have been calling the Falcons about Ridley and trading for Ridley, and the Falcons have not engaged in those trade talks in good faith because they knew this was coming down the pipe. So obviously we'll get more details in the coming days, weeks, and or months. But basically what this means, long story short, Calvin Ridley is now done in Atlanta. There were questions about his future in Atlanta going into this offseason, and now we have an answer to that he's no longer going to be an Atlanta Falcon. His contract, however, he's still going to be under contract. He'll probably be put on the suspended list in the coming days, and his contract will toll the final year of his rookie contract, where he was set to make $11 million, will toll to the next season, which means that he won't count against the Falcons salary cap in 2022, but will potentially in 2023 if and when he is reinstated. And so therefore he can then continue his NFL career, but it's probably certainly not going to come with the Atlanta Falcons. And so my expectation is that the Falcons, at their earliest convenience, will release Calvin Ridley. I don't know exactly when that will be because I don't know necessarily if you're allowed to release players if they're on the suspended list and how that works. But whenever it's time for the Falcons are allowed to release Calvin Ridley, I do expect them to do that when that happens, whether that's this offseason or next offseason. We'll just sort of have to see, and we'll take a deeper look into why I think the Falcons will ultimately release Calvin Ridley instead of potentially trading him at a later date later in the episode. But let's just say I'm not going to necessarily make a moral judgment on Calvin Ridley at this time, nor am I going to sit here and make a moral judgment on the NFL for being involved in gambling. And one of the partners that the NFL had in their, gambling was one of the sites that Calvin Ridley used on his phone, and that was one of the reasons why he got caught, because the NFL has put out ways in which they can monitor if NFL players are betting on football. NFL players can bet on other sports, but they can't bet on football. And I'm not going to sit here and call the NFL a hypocrite, as you might see some people, because they're making money off of gambling and it doesn't allow players. For obvious reasons, players can't bet on football, right? Like it hurts the integrity of the game when it comes to that. So I can't sit here and bash the NFL for that. I'm not going to bash Calvin Ridley for doing a thing that I do on a weekly basis here. And we're going to be promoting, you guys to gamble later on today's episode with a bet online. So I can't sit here and say, oh, Calvin Ridley's morally bankrupt for betting on football, but he broke a rule, right? It's an obvious rule. And these are the consequences to him breaking that rule. And so, from a moral standpoint, again, seems, oh, he's a bad person for breaking this rule, but it's an obvious rule that you just can't break. And while I have all the sympathy in the world for Calvin Ridley and his ongoing mental health struggles, or, I have all the sympathy for anybody who's going through mental health struggles, as I have struggled with mental health. Many of you guys out there watching or listening have gone through mental health struggles. Have all the sympathy in the world for Calvin Ridley as he works through that, whatever he needs to work through in the coming months and or years to get through that. And again, that's not something that just simply you can snap your fingers and go away, as anybody who's dealt with mental health struggles knows. But I don't have any sympathy for Calvin Ridley getting suspended for betting on football. You just got to know, man, you can't do that. It's like one of the few rules that you just can't do. You can't bet on your own sport. You can bet on basketball, you can bet on baseball, Calvin Ridley, but you can't bet on football. So I have really no sympathy for him in that regard. And so it's pretty cut and dry, at least as far as that goes. And now he's going to deal with the consequences of that by missing this upcoming season, and we'll see what his NFL future is beyond that. But obviously the Falcons are going to deal with some consequences because they will be without Calvin Ridley for this upcoming season, which, as I mentioned before, is not necessarily a new development since there had been ongoing trade rumors for the last couple of months, but certainly by him being suspended and not being able to trade him this offseason, the Falcons are now losing and dealing with the consequences of losing a significant trade asset. And we'll get into how the Falcons handle those consequences as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But let's, segue into the thing that's impossible to segue into. Let's talk about betonline.net. You will not lose your job, or at least you shouldn't get suspended from your job. I don't know exactly what all you guys are doing. If you head on over to betonline.net and you can bet on football or basketball or boxing or UFC or hockey, you can bet on who's the first Georgia player to get drafted in this upcoming draft, which the smart money says is Trayvon Walker. You can bet on the number one pick. You can bet on the top quarterback to get drafted, which again, the money at betonline.net is saying that, that's going to be potentially Malik Willis. So you can bet on all those things relatively consequence free. So why don't you head on over to betonline.net today? You can sign up with their easy to use website or use your mobile device, much like Calvin Ridley, and you can navigate that very easily at betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. So now we've been talking for the last couple of months, really since early January, that the Falcons had the potential to move on from Calvin Ridley. And while we've not had a sort of hard confirmed report that the Falcons are definitely going to move Ridley, we've been thinking that, things have been heading in that direction, and we were just sort of waiting on what the offers the Falcons would get in. And there were reports Monday before this news broke that the Falcons had been getting offers from teams like the Patriots and the Browns. So apparently they were some of those teams that had been calling the Falcons in the last couple of weeks. So if you're a Falcon fan that has been living under a rock for the last 2 months, or you're a fan of another football team that's, checking in on Locked On Falcons today, welcome to the show to find out more information on this. You probably didn't realize that Calvin Ridley already, before the suspension, was probably not going to be a Falcon in 2022. Anyway, now we know he definitely won't be a Falcon in 2022. And obviously, that has a significant loss to the football team on the football field. And we've talked about how losing Ridley in the middle of last season, when around Halloween, when he stepped away to deal with his mental health issues, had that impact on the team. And a lot of that was due to the fact that Calvin Ridley, prior to the 2021 season, had been one of the league's most explosive wide receivers in the NFL. Over his first 3 years, from 2018 through the 2020 season, Calvin Ridley ranked 11th in the NFL in terms of generating 20-plus yard plays, with 46 across 44 games in that 3-year span. Julio Jones, player the Falcons traded last summer, was number 2 on that list with 61 such plays. And so if you're sitting there saying, oh, well, the reason why Calvin Ridley was so productive because he was playing across from Julio Jones, well, you look at those last 5 games in the 2020 season where Julio Jones was not playing because he was sidelined with a hamstring injury that continued to plague him in the 2021 season. Calvin Ridley had 10 such big plays in that 5-game sample. But then, of course, in 2021, Calvin Ridley played in only 5 games this past season and only had 3 such big plays. So that drop in production from going from one of the league's most explosive receivers in the NFL in the previous years to one of the, barely making any of those explosive plays in the first part of the season was a big contributing factor to why the Falcons offense kind of struggled starting out of the gates. And that was a loss that the Falcons really were not able to recover from as the season progressed without Calvin Ridley. And one of the things that we talked about since the end of the season was, in order for this offense to bounce back and rebound and get back to a level where they were one of the top offenses in the league prior to this past season, where they were one of the least effective offenses in the league, and Matt Ryan had one of his least productive seasons this past year, the Falcons needed to find ways to generate explosive plays. And the easiest way to do that was getting Calvin Ridley back in the fold and getting him to rebound at his pre-2021 levels in terms of that explosiveness. And so I had been a strong advocate that, even though I was aware of the impending, eventual, inevitable, whatever you want to call it, trade of Calvin Ridley, I felt like it was in the team's best interest from a pure football standpoint to get Calvin Ridley back in the fold. But obviously, we know that is not the case. And one of the things that was going to be a major question mark for this football team headed into the 2022 season was whether it was replacing Calvin Ridley directly or replacing his production. How were they going to get that level of production? We already talked about on previous episodes of this podcast that an impending free agent like Russell Gage, who had basically 800 yards last season, being able to come out and find a player that can produce 800 yards is relatively hard when you look at the history of teams signing players in free agency, of teams drafting players, and getting that type of production immediately in 2022 was already going to be a tough bet. You couple that with potentially replacing now what we saw Calvin Ridley was in 2020, which is a 1,400-yard receiver, nearly a 1,400-yard receiver. That was going to be virtually impossible for the Falcons to find that type of production, and particularly in this draft where there is not a Jamar Chase, there is not a Jalen Waddle, there is not a Devontae Smith that is going to come in and be that guy. And as we see the news unfold over the next couple of days and weeks, where teams tagging wide receivers, the Chris Godwins, the Devontae Adams, etc., of the world that are headed to hit the market, we may not see as many of those big name wide receivers that can come in and be that level of production. And certainly one has concerns about the Falcons cap situation, that even if they were in a position to go out there and sign an Allen Robinson or an Amari Cooper, could they really afford to fork up that type of money to go out there and sign someone of that caliber? And so we wondered openly if Russell Gage's status was tied to Calvin Ridley's future in Atlanta. And if Calvin Ridley was moved, does that increase the odds that Russell Gage would be coming back in Atlanta? Who knows at this point in time? If you listen to Friday's episode where we did a free agent Friday, where I broke down the sort of an off season, where I thought looking at basically a dozen free agent targets that I think the Falcons should sign on offense, we talked all about revamping the wide receiver room, because in that exercise, Russell Gage was walked in free agency. Calvin Ridley was traded, and basically the only receiver that the Falcons have currently under contract is Frank Darby. And so I went about in that episode, basically naming, a dozen or so wide receivers that I would potentially target on the cheap, to come in and completely revamp and revitalize this Falcons wide receiver room, and going cheap at that position so that I could go about and really invest my limited resources that the Falcons have this offseason from a cap standpoint into fixing their offensive line, which to me is a much more prudent issue moving forward. But again, this wide receiver issue is prudent, right? Russell Gage is a free agent. Calvin Ridley's now suspended. Tajay Sharp is an unrestricted free agent as well. Olamide Zaccheaus and Christian Blake are both restricted free agents, and their future in Atlanta is up for grabs. And so now the Falcons are looking at a situation where they definitely have to replace Calvin Ridley. Instead of possibly replacing Calvin Ridley, you can sit here and say the positive is that the Falcons are going to get cap relief because of the nature of his suspended, and thus essentially the guaranteed money on his contract is now essentially voided, and they'll get that $11 million in saving. But in that exercise that we did on Free Agent Friday, again, I already was taking account of trading Calvin Ridley. So it's not like they're getting more cap space than what I was getting in that sort of hypothetical exercise where I was trading him, and then signing a whole bunch of cheap free agents to sort of fill that void. So, replacing Calvin Ridley, replacing his production, and really this wide receiver room, and revitalizing, revamping, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a major question mark for this current Falcons regime headed by head coach Arthur Smith, as well as general manager Terry Fontenot this offseason. It's going to be one of the big question marks that linger for this team in the near future, overall. You lose Julio Jones last offseason. He wanted out. Whether Calvin really wanted out or not is essentially moot at this point because he's done in Atlanta as well. So your two big prime playmakers are now done in Atlanta. Now, how do you fill that void? We know Kyle Pitts, the Falcons' top selection in 2021 NFL draft, is part of that answer of filling that void. And I expect much bigger things from Kyle Pitts in 2022, and was expecting much bigger things before this Ridley news broke, in terms of what he could do in 2022 and be that sort of go-to playmaker and be the focus of the Falcons offense. But it's going to be about surrounding him with talent. Right. We know Pitts had a historically great rookie season for a rookie tight end this past year, and we hope that he can be, a historically great second season for a second year tight end going into 2022. But what do you put around him? And again, it's going to be a major question mark in terms of the short term for this regime. The other short term question mark is the other issue that I talked about, where I basically sacrificed the wide receiver room so I could upgrade the offensive line, because fixing the offensive line, which has been a problem spot for this Falcons offense for the last couple of years, much more so than the wide receiver room. We can certainly make the case the wide receiver room was problematic in 2022, but with the play of Kyle Pitts, with the play of Cordero Patterson, another impending free agent, with the play of Russell Gage in the second half of the season, it was arguably, at least I argue, it was much less of an issue than the offensive line was this past season. And so to me, in terms of the short-term issues, Falcons going to have to replace Calvin Ridley in terms of adding playmakers at that receiver room, and you're also going to have to fix this offensive line, not to mention the long-term consequences and issues that this Falcon team is going to have to face, which is, what do they do in the future at the quarterback position? Is their life after Matt Ryan? How do they solve that problem moving forward? Is Matt Ryan going to continue to play another high level for the next couple of years, or do the Falcons are looking to replace him? And I'm at this point in time looking at it where I think the Falcons are likely to replace him. But again, I don't know if this Ridley situation impacts that in a lot of ways. And then you look at the other long-term issue that the Falcons have to deal with, which is rebuilding their defense. Now, in terms of the short term on rebuilding that defense, you want to think that they're going to make significant improvement to their pass rush, which was a league worst last year in terms of generating sack production in 2021. So in the short term, you got to fix that pass rush. You got to upgrade that unit. How much growth can you show this offseason? That's a big question mark for this offseason. But as we talk about in terms of the long term, over the next 2-3 years, right? Potentially, how do you rebuild this defense? And so these questions, the future at quarterback, adding playmakers, fixing the offensive line, rebuilding the defense, these are sort of the four big questions surrounding this current regime headed by Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot, and how they answer these issues, how they solve these problems, whatever you want to call them, is going to determine whether this regime is successful here in Atlanta, or we're looking, at a completely different coaching staff, a completely different front office in a couple of years from now to have them solve these problems if this regime can't fix it. So that's going to be the big question lingering. And obviously, dealing with Calvin Ridley and his suspension certainly isn't helping matters, but I don't necessarily know if it means like all of a sudden the Falcons offseason is thrown into turmoil because, again, he was already headed out the door, presumably, and now we definitely know he's headed out the door. So we're not going to be able to trade Calvin Ridley this offseason, but it still leaves the door open for to potentially trade him next offseason. But as I said earlier on today's episode, I do not expect that to happen. I do expect the Falcons, when they get the opportunity to release Calvin Ridley, that they will wind up doing that. And I'll explain exactly why I think that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, where you can get insight into all the other stories going on around the NFL. I didn't think the Falcons would be tops of the topics on Locked On NFL, as with so many other things going on with the combine, with free agents, with franchise tags. But of course, I'm sure you'll find me on the Locked On NFL podcast today, if as you're listening to this, or tonight, or whenever, if you're watching this shortly. But definitely check out the Locked On NFL podcast, all on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, if you want to get coverage of the other 31 NFL teams. And I also want to tell you that today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Rock Auto. With ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need for your vehicle. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer, when you already have access to rockauto.com already in your pocket or at home? Save time and money when you use Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts at a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and they have reliably low prices for every customer, and they have everything you need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now. It's an easy-to-use website, and see all the parts available for your car or truck. You can write locked on, in there, how did you hear about us box, so that they know we sent you. Again, that right, locked on in the how did you hear about us box, so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So, wrapping up today's episode, let me explain why I do think the Falcons will ultimately release Calvin Ridley at their earliest convenience. And again, don't know quite what the rules are that says when they can do that. If they can do that while he's suspended, they can do that before they put him on the suspension list, or they have to wait until he gets reinstated into the league, presumably at some point in February of 2023 or thereafter. So don't know the timeline as far as that. And again, as we find out more information on this in the coming days and weeks, I'm sure be able to give you an update on that. But I sit here and I don't think the Falcons are just going to sit here and waiting for him to get reinstated so that they can trade him at a future date. And I understand from a lot of people's perspective, particularly if you're a Falcon fan listening to this episode, you're sitting here wondering, like, why wouldn't we wait? And we still hold his rights for 2023 and beyond. He's still under contract for that season, presuming that he is going to get reinstated, and getting something for him is better than getting nothing for him. And, again, theoretically, in principle, you're absolutely right. But what is that something going to be? And I think that something is essentially practically going to be nothing. And because I think you really have to stop and think about it, not from the Falcons' perspective, but think about it from one of the other 31 teams' perspective, if you were looking to acquire Calvin Ridley, right? Given the whole mental health thing that he was battling this upcoming season, and again, whether it's fair or unfair to, use that as a way of questioning his commitment to football, or whatever the case may be, is certainly a topic of debate that we're not going to get into on today's episode. But you already had those sort of questions for him, and then on top of that, he's going to get suspended for lack of better term, one of the stupidest things that you can get suspended for. You're going to have a lot of questions about Calvin Ridley and his future in the NFL, and whether or not you can make a commitment to that guy. Because again, if you're acquiring Calvin Ridley, you're acquiring him on his current contract, which is going to pay him $11 million towards the 2023 salary cap if you were to wait until next season to trade for him. And so you look at Calvin Ridley at this point in time, right now, and presumably where he'll be a year from now, you're going to look at him probably with the same sort of light and eyes that teams look at Josh Gordon right now, right? Josh Gordon, a player that has been suspended and had to step away from football for multiple seasons due to his issues with substance abuse. And certainly you can sit here and say Josh Gordon's substance abuse issues, Calvin Ridley's gambling, Calvin Ridley's mental health issues, these are not quite the same thing. And you're right. Again, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of differences between those things specifically. But again, from an NFL team's perspective, if it comes down to trust and accountability and whether or not you can be on the field, available on Sunday to deliver on the football field, you look at Josh Gordon, you look at Calvin Ridley, and you don't see that much difference from that perspective. The whys and hows that they are not available, they're not delivering on the football field are different. But at the end of the day, you're looking at the results and the ends sort of justifying the means from that perspective of he's not delivering, he's not there for us. So why should we put that faith and that trust in him to merit us paying him $11 million, which currently would make him, based off of the 2023 salary cap and his cap hit there, is going to make him one of the 20 highest paid wide receivers then. And we're also going to give up premium draft assets for that guy until Calvin Ridley can show that he's taken control of his personal life. Why would you sit here and be willing to show that faith and that trust to be able to give up that if you're one of the other 31 NFL teams? And you look at Josh Gordon, who did himself get traded in 2018 to the New England Patriots, a team that on Friday's episode we talked about the Falcons potentially trading Calvin Ridley to. The Patriots did give up a 7th round pick in 2018 to the Cleveland Browns for Josh Gordon at the beginning of that season, after Gordon had basically missed the better part of 3 years with the Browns dealing with those substance abuse issues that led to his multiple suspensions during that time, and wound up, playing, I think 11 games for the Patriots, was semi-productive in those 11 games, but wound up getting suspended again and having to step away from football again to deal with his mental health issues. And Josh Gordon has been in and out of the league ever since then. And if we're looking at that Josh Gordon trade that the Patriots had as sort of the precedent, and I don't see any reason why we wouldn't look at that as the precedent, a 7th round pick, like you're going to sit here and you're going to hold on to Calvin Ridley's rights so that you can garner a 7th round pick. Again, I could be 100% wrong in assessing this, and maybe you can get much more than that sort of late round pick that the Browns got for Josh Gordon after holding his rights for, 3 seasons after his initial suspension. But I sit here and I go, like, what's the value of that? And so unless you're going to get like a 3rd round pick, which I sit here today, I say is extremely doubtful. Again, I don't know, can't predict the future, can't necessarily foresee how other NFL teams are going to look at this situation. But again, based off of what little precedent we've had for a similar situation of a highly talented wide receiver being suspended for missing the better part of multiple seasons for, again, mental health, I have all the sympathy in the world, and that's not something that Calvin Ridley controls. But this is certainly something that Calvin Ridley controls, and made a really stupid mistake with gambling on football. I don't see how other NFL teams are going to give him the benefit of the doubt that we as Falcon fans, because of the time that we have spent with Calvin Ridley, are willing to give him and say, oh, like he's gonna figure it out and do all these things. If you're another NFL team, like, why would you sit here and think that? Right. So you're going to sit here and be like, oh, we're not going to trade for Calvin Ridley. And if we do, we're going to give you like a conditional 7th round pick in 2028 or something like that, at a point in time where it's like, oh, like, well, we traded for Calvin Ridley 5 years ago or whatever the case may be, where at that point in time, it can't hurt you. You know what I'm saying? So I sit here and I go, like, because of that reason, you're not going to get trade value for him. Is essentially the long, the short version of what I'm talking about. So you're just going to wind up cutting him anyway, because what you're going to get for him in trade value is not going to be worth keeping him. And so for me right now, I sit here, as regardless of how it impacts the Falcons from a football on-field standpoint, what it impacts the Falcons from their wallet standpoint, from their draft asset standpoint, I just hope Calvin Ridley, the best for Calvin Ridley. I do have sympathy for him. I do hope Calvin Ridley gets his NFL career back on track. I hope he gets his life back on track. Again, I have all the sympathy in the world for him. We're dealing with these ongoing mental health struggles, and I'm certainly him taking another year off from football certainly is not going to help him in that regard. Hopefully it does not hurt him in that regard. But at the same time, I hope we don't sit here and whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now or 5 years from now, we're having the same conversations about Calvin Ridley that we have or we're having about Josh Gordon, that we're having about Henry Ruggs, of very promising young wide receivers. And I'm sure there's many other names that we could throw on that list of very promising young, talented wide receivers and young NFL players that made, some relatively, poor choices in their life. And it cost them their NFL careers, their very talented NFL careers. And I hope we're not having that conversation about Calvin Ridley in the future. And so that's where we're going to leave today's Locked On Falcons podcast. Obviously, we'll have more to say on this if and when more information comes available, and certainly in terms of covering it from the Falcons from a salary cap standpoint and a trade asset and a release standpoint, all those various things. When we get more information on that, certainly we'll give you an update here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. But hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the combine, about how it impacts the Falcons draft selection. And certainly if you're sitting here wondering, does this mean that the Falcons will take a wide receiver at 8? I don't think so. But again, I still am skeptical of that, but you never know with the Falcons. Again, we've talked about on previous mock draft Mondays where it's a possibility. I wouldn't bet on it at this point in time, but it's certainly a possibility that the Falcons could take a wide receiver at the top of this 2022 NFL draft in round 1. I think it's more likely that they'll wait until day 2 of this draft in rounds 2 or 3 to take a wide receiver, but we'll just sort of have to see. And that will be something that we will probably talk a little bit more about combine winners and losers on tomorrow's episode that I would have talked about on today's episode if not for this breaking news. But we'll have more coverage of the most recent scouting combine and the Falcons draft future, as well as free agents. We're going to do Free Agent Friday later this week in terms of looking at some defensive players on that. So if you want to stay tuned, by all means, you can subscribe to Locked On Falcons on a variety of podcast platforms. If you want to get more insight into this draft process, of course, you can subscribe to the Locked On NFL Draft podcast hosted by Eric Crocker and Ryan Tracy, as they give you more of their insights into sort of who helped themselves and who hurt themselves this past weekend at the scouting combine. So you can subscribe to that on the same podcast platforms you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So guys, that's going to do it for us here. Of course, I'm always open to your feedback on this very specific issue. I'm sure I will get many of your angry or some of you maybe not so angry feedback on this specific issue. And of course, you can do so on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or of course, you can leave a comment right here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So guys, that's going to do it for us here on Locked On Falcons. Until then.